Before we kick things off at Indian Wells, I had Djokovic, Zverev, and Fonseca all putting on a show in the desert. Well, that didn't quite happen, and it looks like history's repeating itself. It's that time of year again for Novak. Zverev is still not ready to make a charge for the #1 spot, and Fonseca's doubters are back at it again, saying that he's been overhyped and that he got exposed. Last week in tennis was a lesson, and these are my biggest takeaways. Court conditions were a major talking point all week, and players were affected differently. After losing to Botic van de Zandschulp, Djokovic said that the difference between the center court and the other courts where he practiced was huge, and that the ball was bouncing higher on the center court, higher than some of the highest clay courts he'd played on. Alcaraz said the slow, bouncy conditions were good for him, and so did Ben Shelton, who was particularly happy with how his serves bounced off the court and the liveliness it added to his game. Medvedev delivered as expected with the sarcastic comments about the conditions and said it was the slowest court he's ever played on. And Tsitsipas said the balls at Indian Wells were slightly softer and had more air movement than the ones in Dubai, and that he was going for more aggressive topspin shots because of the grittiness of the surface. On the women's side, Rybakina said the balls were bouncing lower and that the resurfaced courts weren't all that faster following the change. Sabalenka then said that although the bounce was lower, the court was actually faster. Look, I'm not a court manufacturing expert, but when you see this lack of consistency coming from the perspectives of some of the best players in the world, something is definitely up. I personally think it's just a difference in the players' games and play styles that's causing the discrepancy here. You see on the women's side, players like Rybakina and Sabalenka saying that the balls weren't bouncing as high as someone like Tsitsipas, but maybe that's just due to a difference in play styles. Rybakina and Sabalenka are hitting a lot flatter and lower over the net anyway than Tsitsipas, so maybe it's something that has to do with perception and how each player is tackling the game. As far as what Novak said about the lack of standardization regarding the court resurfacing, I'm not too sure what to make about it. The companies that get these contracts at 1000s, 500s, and even 250s are all top of the line, and they know what they're doing. Maybe it was a difference in conditions on the day? I don't know. Anyway, let's talk about Novak's loss. Djokovic losing to Botic van de Zandschulp was perhaps the biggest upset of the first week, but if you look at his results at this time of the year over the last decade, you would notice a trend. After doing the Indian Wells three-peat from 2014 to 2016, Novak has more often than not been disappointing in March. In 2017, he loses twice to Kyrgios in the span of 12 days in Mexico and in the California desert. Fast forward to 2018, and he has some really bad losses to Taro Daniel and Benoit Paire at Indian Wells in Miami. It's 2019, and it's a straight sets loss to Philip Kohlschreiber in California and Roberto Bautista Agut in Miami. And for one reason or the other, Novak doesn't get to play the Sunshine Double for the next 4 years. He then lost to lucky loser Luca Nardi in the third round last year, before losing yet again to another lucky loser in Botic van de Zandschulp a few days ago. Seeing Djokovic suffer some of the most random losses in his career at this time of the year is probably down to a couple things. He's won enough of these tournaments, so he just doesn't care enough or have the motivation. Or the fact that after outshining everyone at the Australian Open, he usually takes a break, loses some rhythm, and comes back a bit rusty and lacking in match fitness. Either way you slice it, I've come to the conclusion that we'll probably not see the best of the GOAT at this time of year ever again, considering the physical demands an almost 38-year-old body puts on you. Back to the match, Novak had 15 winners to 37 unforced errors against Botic, and also had a terrible day on the serve, especially his second serve. The Serbian looked very flat in the first set and was spraying a lot of forehand errors, missing easy returns, and not serving well as he got broken twice. He, however, found a way to turn the match on its head in the second set. Botic's heavy forehand, which troubled Novak in the first set, now seemed to have lost its calibration. Novak had some serving hiccups serving out the second set, but took care of business at the second time of asking. Now, the first few games of the third set were super competitive. Facing breakpoint early on, Novak rushed to the net and ended up getting lobbed. Net rushing on breakpoints is a bit dicey. Personally, I'm not the biggest fan because you could argue it's a bit of a desperate move. And except if the previous shot puts your opponent behind the 8 ball, I don't think it's the best time to come forward off shots that your opponent can easily get to. All Botic had to do was hit a relatively routine backhand, which Djokovic rushed forward to attack but just couldn't. The second time Djokovic got broken in the third set, he attempted a forehand drop shot, which Botic managed to reach. From a strategic standpoint, the longer a point is, the more neutral it becomes, and the more likely your opponent is to win the point if it's on your serve, which is why you often see players sometimes try to shorten points when facing a break point. That said, it's all about knowing the right move to make at the right time, and for one reason or the other, Djokovic didn't do that against Botic. It's only the second time Djokovic has lost 3 consecutive matches since the start of the 2008 season. But if history tells us anything, it's that we can't make anything out of this Novak loss, and I'll go as far as saying that it'll have no bearing on the rest of his season. But for Botic, boy is he quickly becoming the GOAT Slayer. He's had huge wins over Alcaraz, Nadal, and Djokovic in the last 7 months, and the best part is seeing his stoic composure after each of these wins. He considered retirement not too long ago, and his results haven't exactly been good over a long stretch, but you can tell that he's quickly becoming the guy that no seeded player wants to face. On the other hand, yet again we were deprived of another possible Djokovic-Alcaraz clash. What a bummer. But Zverev's fans would have been even more disappointed in the German's performance against Griekspoor. Now, I should totally say that Griekspoor hasn't always been the easiest of players for Zverev. All of their previous 5 matches had either gone to a decider or needed a tiebreak in at least one set. Last week wasn't any different. Zverev started the match on the front foot and only dropped 5 points on his serve the entire set. He broke Griekspoor in the 5th game and never looked back. The serve then took a huge dip in the 2nd set, and although Zverev was still making a lot of first serves, he was winning fewer points off of it thanks to some amazing returns from Griekspoor. Although Zverev served for the match in the 2nd set, coming from 2-5 to 6-5, he was unable to get over the line, and Griekspoor edged him in the 2nd set tiebreaker to force a decider. The 3rd set was even more dramatic. Zverev's serve was almost a shadow of what it was in the 1st set. Griekspoor broke him in the 11th game and was supposed to close out the match, but here's what happened. On the first match point, we see a forehand error off a deep return down the middle from Zverev. On the second match point, it was a wild cross-court forehand into the doubles alley. The third one was a volley dumped into the net following a questionable approach. And the fourth was yet another wild forehand error off a return down the middle from Zverev. The crazy part is that Griekspoor wasn't missing by tiny margins on these shots. He was just spraying wildly and missing by feet. You could tell that it was a mental thing and that Griekspoor just wanted the win that badly. A brilliant backhand down the line helped Zverev save the 5th match point before forcing a tiebreak on his 5th break point. Griekspoor then regrouped to take the match on his 6th match point in a match that lasted over 3 hours. Looking back in hindsight, you can't help but wonder if the pressure to become #1 forced Zverev into a poorly planned schedule where he played in Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico in the span of 14 days. I mean, look at his performance in the last 4 tournaments. A 4-4 record since the Australian Open final is as bad as it gets for the top seed at Indian Wells. For Griekspoor, there's still room for growth on the mental side, and hopefully the win over Zverev fuels him to do better under pressure. It's his first win over a top 5 player in 19 attempts. But what happened to the #4 seed Casper Ruud? Wasn't the slow bouncing conditions supposed to work in his favor? After Ruud and Giron shared the spoils in the first 2 sets, we saw Casper's serve completely fall apart, with 6 double faults alone in the deciding set. It was a rapid decline in performance from what we saw in the 2nd set from Ruud, and at this point, I have to say that being a Casper fan can be pretty tough at times. His inconsistencies on hard courts and his inability to unlock that extra gear when the chips are down are becoming really obvious. With a lot of points to defend at Monte Carlo and Barcelona, Ruud is at risk of falling outside of the top 10. Speaking of falling outside of the top 10 soon, Rublev missed another chance to gather lots of points before Madrid, losing to Arnaldi in his opening match. Arnaldi is a respectable opponent, and he beat Rublev at Roland Garros last year. Rublev struggled to hold serve all match, was wasteful on break points, and seemed to have a lot of lapses in concentration, giving breaks back easily like he was doing some sort of charity donation. Oh, and the way he constantly dumped his shots into the net was really strange to me. Basically, it's not even about losing, it's the way he lost. Also, Rublev seems to be losing in the early rounds of tournaments way too frequently, and it's just more than we're used to seeing. 12 first-round exits in the last 52 weeks. For a player who'd been consistent for the longest time, it's a bit of a head-scratcher. Has he gone from a consistent to streaky player? Let me know what you think in the comments. Medvedev and Tsitsipas both had great first weeks. Medvedev's level specifically was higher than it's been in a while. Switching focus to the American men, the first week was a mixed bag. Lerner Tien didn't get the debut he would have hoped for. He played under extreme weather conditions, was a little sick, and lost to Navone in straights. Korda also lost to Gael Monfils. Korda hasn't won a single match since losing in the second round of the Australian Open, but it's not like he's played a lot of matches either. His physical struggles and his obvious lack of match toughness continue to prevent him from reaching his full potential. And then we have Tiafoe losing to world 349 Watanuki, which, although I didn't see coming, wasn't all that surprising. Tiafoe hasn't won back-to-back matches this year, and he's racked up quite a number of losses to lower-ranked opponents since last year's US Open. That being said, Watanuki strikes me as a really interesting player. I broke down some of the strange things he does technique-wise in this week's edition of our newsletter, the Courtside Digest. Check it out if you haven't already, and for those who aren't subscribed yet, I'll leave the link in the description. A 5-5 record for the year and an 8-10 record since the US Open tells you everything you need to know about Tiafoe's consistency. He was all over the place pranking umpires and forgetting rackets before losing to a world number 349 who's being coached by his former coach Wayne Ferreira. I don't mean to sound critical, but I'm tempted to question Tiafoe's motivation. On the bright side, we have Shelton, who's loving the conditions so far, and then Taylor Fritz, who's also still in the mix. But let's talk about Joao Fonseca for a second. Although the scoreline was as one-sided as it gets, I was kind of happy for Fonseca because the loss to Draper will give him valuable learning opportunities, and I don't think anyone should be making a big deal of the fact that an 18-year-old kid lost to a borderline top 10 player. That's why it's super strange that some fans called Fonseca overhyped for losing to Draper. What were you expecting? That'll blast everyone off the court and become world number 1 this year? That's not exactly how it works. Here's the thing. If Fonseca loses to a top player, it's not a big deal. However, if he beats a top player like he did to Rublev in Melbourne, it's definitely worth talking about. The loss to Draper will give Fonseca an idea of how to handle players with elite defending skills and consistency from the back of the court. For instance, there was a 21-shot rally at the end of the third game. Unfortunately, I can't show the footage at the moment, but I'm working towards being able to do that in the next couple of weeks. But the point I'm trying to get to is that the 21-shot rally was one of many instances where Draper completely absorbed Fonseca's firepower, which invariably forced the Brazilian to go for too much and eventually miss. Draper also used the drop shot to great effect to expose Fonseca's movement. Draper passed the Fonseca test with flying colors, and so did all the top seeds on the women's tour in the first week. Starting with Coco Gauff, we saw her win ugly against Uchijima in the opening round. She then put on a more solid display against Maria Sakkari. It seems like there's no permanent fix to the double faults and sketchy forehand at the moment, but once again, Coco continues to prove that she's a champion by getting through these kinds of matches. Madison Keys continues to win matches like nobody's business, but it's the same old story for Naomi Osaka, who isn't quite at the level she'd have hoped to be at. Iga has dropped only a handful of games so far, and has been playing some of her best tennis under these conditions. Sabalenka is still in the mix at the time of this recording, and Jessica Pegula was just upset by Alina Svitolina in what for me was a contender for match of the tournament. All in all, we're going to be in for an insanely competitive second week on the women's side. But let's talk about the paid maternity leave for the women, an announcement that was made on Thursday. This is pretty huge news for tennis. The WTA just made history with the first real maternity leave for pro athletes who are independent contractors. Players can now get paid for up to a year when they have a kid. Saudi Arabia's PIF is bankrolling the whole thing, and they're going beyond just maternity leave. They're also covering fertility stuff like egg freezing and IVF, even backdated to January. About 320 players now qualify for these benefits. Now, I know people have their thoughts about the PIF, and I'm not disregarding that, but this is definitely a huge win for women's tennis. WTA CEO Portia Archer said, quote, "That's certainly one of the aims of the program, to provide the financial resources, the flexibility, the support, so that these athletes, regardless of where they're ranked, but particularly those who earn less, will have that agency to decide when and how they want to start their families," end quote. Fans seem mostly pumped about this, but there are still some questions about exactly how much money players will receive. While Archer's comments suggest that the program will provide more support to lower-ranked players, specific details on payment structures aren't fully clear yet. Whatever the final implementation, this initiative could make a huge difference in allowing players to extend their careers while also getting to have families. Unfortunately for some players, though, they were on the receiving end of every athlete's worst nightmare last week. Man, Vondrushova just can't catch a break with these injuries. She's taking time off again, this time for her shoulder. She made an Instagram post saying she's really going to take a step back to rehab from her injury. Quote, "Gotta rehab, need patience, hope to be back soon." End quote. But seriously, how many comebacks can one player make? I think this is like her fourth major injury timeout. The elbow in 2016, wrist surgery after that French Open final in 2019, another wrist surgery after the Olympics, and now the shoulder. It's crazy that after all that, she still pulled off being the first unseeded Wimbledon champ in 2023. Her body's taking a beating though, and you gotta wonder if we'll remember her more for these constant injuries than for what she's done on the court. Speaking of players battling their own body, Badosa pulled out of Indian Wells with that same back problem. Really bad timing since she was finally playing great tennis again with that Australian Open semi-final run, and she had also just returned to the top 10. Talk about bad luck. Building up all that momentum just to have your body quit on you. I remember last year at Indian Wells when doctors told her she might need to retire. That's how bad her back is. There's also definitely a mental game to dealing with chronic injuries. How do you stay positive when your body keeps failing you? And with tennis being a non-stop global tour with different surfaces every few weeks, players with ongoing issues like hers just can't keep up with the full schedule anymore. And then there's Nick Kyrgios breaking down crying at Indian Wells after retiring from his match with a wrist injury. Did you see it? It was honestly really hard to watch. He said the rehab process has been one of the hardest challenges he's faced and that he's doing everything possible to get back. The reactions to his situation are all over the place. Some fans feel bad for him, others act like he deserves it because of his past behavior. But should we really be connecting someone's personality with their physical pain? It seems a little messed up. Anyways, he's pushing 30 now with these recurring wrist problems, so his singles future doesn't look great. Maybe doubles could work since it's easier on the body, but honestly, we might be watching the end of Kyrgios' tennis career right now. Anyhow, I wish him the best, and I hope he can recover from this. Guys, the second week of Indian Wells has been electric, and I'm super excited for what's to come. It seems like Holger Rune and Daniil Medvedev are on a crash course for the semifinal, and I'll be super excited to see how they stack up against Alcaraz. On the women's side, what Alina Svitolina is doing right now is nothing short of amazing, and I'm excited to see if Keys can keep her hot streak going too. If you loved this video, be sure to like and subscribe, and don't miss out on any of the action here on Courtside Tennis. And also, if you haven't already, check out our newsletter. We wrote something that you've never seen before from Yosuke Watanuki. Until next time, keep going for the lines.